Welcome. It is my pleasure and honor to be up here with two amazing experts on China and the U.S. relationship and many other things. And so I think we should just get right to it. Let's start with a really broad question, which is, how do you see the current state of the U.S. China relationship?
Well, first, you said we're experts. I think a China expert is an oxymoron, or just a moron. I mean, it's so complex, so fast-moving, so many contradictions. And I say that because it has the virtue of being true, not just to protect our answers. But to get to your question, I think we're in a brand new phase in U.S. China relations. And I think the best way to describe it is controlled enmity. We'd hoped to be partners on the world stage. Then we sort of scaled it back and said maybe we can be wary competitors. As long as Mr. Xi is in power with his domestic and foreign policies, I think we're going to have to live with controlled enmity for the time being. Now, it doesn't mean an absolute hostility or enmity. We should avoid that. And I would say what we do is make sure we avoid conflict through miscalculation or accident or misreading of red lines, manage frictions, and thirdly, continue to seek out areas in global and regional issues, as well as bilateral, where our national interests overlap or converge, and we can do it either cooperation or parallel policies. One more comment, I'll let Orville pick up on this. I think there are two main factors at work getting us to this stage. One is historical, namely China has been growing, and we welcome this in strength and across the board. And you have the historical phenomenon of a rising power and an established power, which means many more areas of cooperation, but many more areas of friction. So it makes it very complex. We should continue to welcome this, and we should continue to work with China, as several administrations have been trying to do. So that's one new factor. China is a much more equal partner, and if we could be a partner. The other factor, though, is the increasing repression at home and aggressiveness abroad. Mr. Xi is anti-American. There's no way we can convince him that we're not out to contain China or to subvert his system. Doesn't mean we don't do business, but it'll be transactional, not in a spirit of cooperation. I say this, it's a bleak picture. I think we can improve it, and our task force will have so many great recommendations that will change the policy overnight.
We're having some audio problems.
Oh, should I start all over again, or what?
No.
How much could you hear? Okay. So I don't even know where I was at this point. But, well, it's a bleak picture, and I hope we can improve it. No illusions about that. But I just don't think we can hope for much better than that in the near future. I do want to add that I've been working for good relations with China for almost half a century. I will continue to do so. But I think we have to be candid, and the best way to improve relations is to be realistic about the stage we're in.
Yeah, listening to you talk, Winston, I was just...
This as well?
I think I'm all right. If I'm not...
if not, why don't we fix mine while we're at it?
I was just thinking back to the time when you were ambassador in China, and apropos of how things wax and wane and flux and change. And Winston and his wife were in China right up until 1989. And it was one of the most extraordinary periods, I think. Now that I look back on it, of course, when you're in the middle of history, you don't always understand that you're in history. But it was a time when, compared to now, there was tremendous amount of openness, but you sensed in China's leaders and China's people a kind of openness, of willingness to embrace all kinds of different ideas, different kinds of influences. You didn't feel that sort of very powerful instinct, which historically speaking has always been there, and I think is back now with, in a rather extreme form of anti-foreignism. You described it as anti-Americanism, and I think there is a strong measure of that.
And it's led from the top.
And I think it certainly encouraged and finds voice at the top. So this is simply to say that if you look at where we are now, I think it's very important to go back to earlier periods to remind yourself that 'twas not ever thus, and that there are different forces that as I said, wax and wane, some towards a more open form of society and some towards a more closed form. And again, these have sort of deep historical roots. Maybe we can talk about it. But I share Winston's concern. I mean, having spent my whole life watching this, when Winston, eschews the notion of an expert, I think we have to sort of recognize and admit to our chagrin that all our years of trying to see through the tea leaves of China don't really help us very well predict where it's going to go. And that is because it is, in fact, quite a contradiction. And different sides of the contradiction sort of emphasize themselves at different moments in history for different reasons. So I think we're at a period of contraction, where this idea of the outside world being one that is hostile rather than friendly has advanced, and that puts the U.S. China relationship, I think, in a very difficult sort of frame of mind.
If I could elaborate a little bit on the historical context, you can sort of artificially break it down by decade. When we opened in the 70s, it was essentially a conceptual, strategic balancing of the Soviet Union relationship, but not much concrete business. It was before normalization. Then at the end of that decade, you had normalization under President Carter, and you began to have trade, investment, mutual visits, and it began to become more normal. We started building that up, but still in the 80s, it was the real glue still was balancing the Soviet Union. Then in 1989, two major events changed the nature of the relationship. On the one hand, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Empire was lost, and so the anti-Soviet glue holding us together disappeared. We had to find new ways to build the relationship. But at the same time, you, of course, had Tiananmen Square, which elevated human rights on the agenda. So this made a much more complicated relationship than the 70s and 80s. So the 90s was spent, I would say, essentially, to pick up Tom's point, repairing bridges and finding new ways to cooperate and beginning to develop more normal trade and investment. But still, China was evolving. Then in the 2000 onward, you had China as a growing regional and global power, and much more interaction, more complex, as I said. Then I think two major dates. 2008, the financial crisis. China felt it got through that quite well, while the U.S. was not only not doing too well, but responsible for it. And so they began to say, hey, we should be an equal here, with some great justification. And then in 2000, and also you had the Olympics and so on, sort of marking their emergence. Then 2012, Mr. Xi came in, and I've already indicated that has led to a much more pessimistic situation.
So I don't want to assume anything, in terms of audience knowledge or even in terms of basic assumptions. So can you untangle a little bit what you mean when you talk about this anti-Americanism and this bleak picture? I mean, what are some of the incidents that recent incidents that have given you this sense that we're at this low point, and especially of the anti-Americanism that you've mentioned for both of you?
Well, I think that there has always been a kind of notion of China as being somehow set upon by the outside world. And you remember that both the Nationalists and the Communist Party came into being and evolved with this idea that was not unreal, that the West was imperial powers that occupied, colonialized, imperialized, and preyed upon the developing world. And China certainly had an experience with that. And I think that very much set the narrative of China up as being a country that was basically victimized by the West and Japan. So that lingered on, and it's still very deeply rooted in the narrative of the Chinese Communist Party. And at different times, it sort of pops back out. And I think of late, what we've seen is there's an expression in Chinese of hostile foreign forces. This is something that's always been in the lexicon of the Chinese Communist Party, but lately we've seen it come to the fore with very prominent leaders using it. And you ask about what manifestations do we see of these tensions. Well, we see a lack of receptivity to foreign NGOs, foreign foundations, which have historically had a very close sort of relationship with China and built a whole set of muscles sort of outside of the governmental framework. You look at the media, the treatment of the media, the Western media has gotten increasingly harsh and increasingly controlled. You look even at business, which used to be sort of a fundamental building block of a no-fault China policy, and you read the American Chamber of Commerce's recent reports, and you find that even business, because of protectionism, intellectual property theft, cyber hacking, a whole host of things, is got a much less roseate picture of the possibilities in China, and thus they aren't coming to bat in support of U.S. China relations to the degree that they once were. So all around the compass rose, if you look at the various sectors of society, NGOs, media, church, academic, business, diplomatic, there really isn't anyone now that is China boosting.
You've hit the highlights, a few other examples. First of all, this comes, as I said, from the top. There's speeches by Xi and his colleagues outlining the threat from the West. I think Xi is haunted by the ghost of Gorbachev, who we felt gave away the Communist Party and the empire by having too much political openness, also color revolutions. And to be fair, I think he honestly believes that we're trying to overthrow his government, not immediately, but through nefarious influences over time of Western ideas.
Another example. An interesting question of what is our intent?
Yeah, well, we can get back to that. Yeah. But another example is there are 7 topics forbidden to be taught in universities. Now, I'm not sure it's always followed strictly, and I can't remember all 7, but and this calls into question another element of university exchange and whether you can have any kind of academic freedom if you're cooperating with Chinese university. But whether it's democracy, rule of law, human rights, you can't talk about this, at least officially, in Chinese schools. So we've always had this strain, as you say, but it's never been this virulent. And I think there's no way to talk Xi out of this. He thinks we're going to try to subvert him, and he also thinks we're trying to contain him. And I'm a great believer in dialogue between leaders, without aides in the room, without talking points. Have a strategic exchange. So you say, what are you up to? What are we up to? What are our goals? What are our red lines? Where can we cooperate? And we should continue to do that. But it's very hard when the other guy thinks you're trying to contain him and subvert him.
So assuming that this is not all happening in a vacuum and that China is not just deciding for no reason to crack down on all of these different entities, are there ways in which the United States has contributed to this problem? Are there policy mistakes that the U.S. has made? Are there ways that the U.S. has conducted itself that could have led to misunderstandings? I mean, there's probably 2 parts to this picture, I would imagine.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, Emily, because no relationship is burdened simply by one side's inability to make it work or refusal to make it work. I mean, I think, I only facetiously half asked you, Winston, what is our intention vis-a-vis the Chinese Communist Party? Now, I've come more and more to believe, as Xi has been in office now 4 years or so, that really the thing that's most difficult for us as Americans to vault over, and maybe we never will, maybe we never should, is the simple fact our value system, our system of governance is completely different. And no matter what you do with those things, they exist. And now you have another sort of added element, which I think really changes the chemistry of the situation. In earlier times, even under Jiang Zemin, and to some degree under Hu Jintao, and certainly under Deng Xiaoping, we did have a sense, and I speak of us as Westerners, Americans, and it wasn't totally illogical that we were the lines were converging between us. That if we did more business, had more students, more cultural exchanges, more discussions like this, more NGOs interacting, the 2 societies, countries, were slowly going to get a little bit more together in terms of openness and what they believed in. I think one of the things that is strikingly different under President Xi is that I don't think he believes that. I think he believes that China has an alternate system. And that means that he's going to defend it. You can understand it. And that means the lines are kind of diverging, not converging. So if you believe they're diverging, then that calls into question a whole lot of very basic things like engagement. Has engagement worked? Can it work? Should we continue it? Are we dealing with a fundamentally antagonistic relationship, as Mao would have said? He divided everything into antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradictions. Or are we in a situation where we can find convergence? We should just stick with it. Remember, we're trying to lead, not get too upset. Just keep doing our civil society thing, having students, diplomacy, working on climate change, working where we can, hoping this will be a period that China will get over. We won't have broken the relationship, and we can continue forward.
Several points. Very good. First, when we express these concerns, this is in sorrow, not in anger, obviously. We genuinely want good relations. I love the Chinese people. My wife's Chinese, so
and my wife's Chinese.
And your wife's Chinese. So we've worked on this, and so it's not meant to reflect hostility. Secondly, I hope it doesn't reflect self-righteousness. Yes, we have some mistakes. I'll just name a couple. I honestly think we do welcome China as part of the international system. We hope it would observe international norms, international law, and also have a right to reform some of those now that they have a greater say in world affairs. And I think that's genuine. But we've made some mistakes. We opposed the Asian Bank and told our allies not to join. We've corrected that now. But if we're trying to get them to do responsible things on the world stage and we oppose whatever their motives are, there is a need for infrastructure, et cetera, in Asia. The same thing, they should have more seats in leadership of the Asian Development Bank or the World, or the IMF, and so on. So I think sometimes our actions haven't kept up with our pronouncements, and I think our genuine attitude. Also, I'm a great supporter of our rebalance, pivot, name it what you will, to Asia. I believe that genuinely was an Asian move, recognizing that this is the key region of this century. It wasn't just China. Obviously, China was part of it, and it wasn't meant to be anti-China. But we didn't explain that to the Chinese from the beginning. We should have had a strategic dialogue, which I don't think we had, saying we're going to put more emphasis on Asia and don't treat this as a hostile move. We have a lot of interest there, and we want to do it. So I think we've made some mistakes as well. On the human rights thing, we have to be careful not to be arrogant in terms of saying you ought to be like us, particularly the way we're looking these days in terms of our democracy, which is not exactly a pristine model of efficiency and civility. But my own view is, and that's why I hate to think of this as Western values versus Chinese. I think they're universal values. And I also think that a looser, more transparent, freer society would serve China's core interests. I mean, just think of their core interests. And I say this to the Chinese all the time. By the way, I also speak as bluntly about Mr. Xi and our relationship just this week with a bunch of Chinese. I do it every week, so we're not. And I say that, again, in my view, the only way to make better progress in our relationship is to be candid, not to mention, when we get to this, be a little firmer in some of our actions. So I think it's important to be open about this, and there are areas of cooperation. But on human rights, they want economic progress. In an age of information and openness, and where you need dynamism and entrepreneurship, is shutting down outside ideas and censoring the internet the best way to have the economy grow? I ask that neutrally. But political stability, if you cannot go to the rule of law because the judges are influenced by the Communist Party, or you can't go to the press with your complaints because it's controlled by the party, and you can't have accountable officials because there's no elections, your only alternative is to take to the streets. And by their own count, they have something like 50 major demonstrations a day and so on. So in terms of political stability, I think a more open society. And then if they want Taiwan to be closer to the mainland, They're never going to have that happen as long as there's a contrast between Taiwan's democracy and what they're up to. And if they want greater credibility on the world stage and with the U.S., a more humane system would serve their purposes. So I say this to Chinese saying, we're not doing it here to lecture you. We're trying to see what we think is in your interest, and you've got to decide, and the Chinese people have to decide your own system. And it ought to be that tone and not arrogance. I haven't had great success.
Because, Emily, what do you think? I mean, when you look at America, how do you think China views us? I mean, sure, they blame us, but what's your view about how they take us in?
Yeah, so I was actually going to ask a similar version of that question to both of you. So I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit just to keep this conversation interesting. And, you know, I think it's getting a little bit harder to make some of the arguments that we once made. So my area is really the internet. I do a lot of work on internet freedom and connectivity in China. And over the past 10 years, we've seen a lot of changes in this area. And, you know, at the current moment, China has it's managed to have its cake and eat it too. They have hundreds of millions of people online, and they have formidable censorship. But I think what's happening now is that, you know, we talk about this difference in values. I think there's a lot of people in China, and even some here, who say, well, Chinese model is kind of working, right? It's working in the sense that, you're right, there's definitely a cost to censorship. There's a cost to researchers not having easy access to Google. There's a cost to innovation, for sure. But this kind of old stereotype that there's no real powerful Chinese brands, that's not true anymore. You know, Tencent's WeChat is a formidable brand. And people say, well, it hasn't broken to the U.S. So what? They have more than 700 million users in China, you know?
I use it.
Yeah, and you know, and probably in this room. China, in terms of mobile technology, is close to surpassing the United States, may even be surpassing the United States by some estimates. You know, Xiaomi, another, you know, the Xiaomi phones are considered kind of cutting edge. So there's all these sort of tropes. Well, the Chinese will never have, you know, world-class brands. They'll never have real innovation. You know, there's so much entrepreneurship happening in China.
None of which either one of us said, by the way.
No. I'm not saying you said that.
Let's not have straw men here, because we all see China rising.
Of course. I'm not correcting your statement. I'm just saying that's been a general impression that, you know, with censorship, China will not be able to innovate, or China will not be a serious economic force. And that's kind of not been the case. And then, from the Chinese side, you know, they look at the U.S., they see our current election cycle. I'm not going to editorialize on that. I'm sure you can all draw your conclusions about what they're seeing. You know, they see things like rampant gun violence. You know, I mean, we talk about, you know, protests in China, that's a problem. But, you know, the gun control situation in the United States, I think when you see that from another country, you're going to have some questions. So I think it's become more of a complicated picture. And I'm not saying that I'm on one side or the other of this, but I think it's harder sometimes for the United States to make its case that, like, our model unequivocally works better than yours. And I'd just be curious to hear what you think about that, because I think it's becoming a little bit more complicated. And I think we've seen this, you know, with the internet again after the Snowden revelations. China had a field day with that, right? They said, you're always lecturing us. Look what we just found out about what your government is doing. So in a lot of ways, there's and you mentioned the financial crisis. That's another example. I mean, I think there was a real turning point for the U.S. and China after that happened, because China said, well, you know, look at us, we're fine. Look at you, you caused this. So who are you to come here and lecture us? And that's just been, I think that's a real tension that we're dealing with right now.
You know, I think I'm glad you raised these questions. I have a son working in Shanghai, and, you know, I think everything that Winston and I have said is true. But this is largely at the top of Chinese society. I mean, the effect of foreign policy, of censorship, of repression, of all of these things. But actually, when you come down a level, it's not as if that has no effect at all, but you find it kind of a surprising vibrancy and dynamism in cities like Shanghai and many, many others, where young people are sort of untouched by these other larger questions and engaging in business. And it's quite exciting and quite dynamic. And I think if you can't sort of make that distinction, it's very hard to explain how China's been so successful. Because
I think it's the Chinese people more than the system would be my
yes, and they're sort of left alone to do what they do, and they're doing it quite well, and with a certain élan and a certain dynamism. So it's just to say this is a very contradictory situation where you can have sort of opposite forces working at different levels at different times, and if you read only one force, you'll only get part of the picture. So it's just a...
I think you made fair points. Let me make two quick comments, one about our society, one about theirs. There's no question one of the costs of what's happening with our toxic political atmosphere and polarization, as exemplified by this election, but preceding it, and gridlock on getting anything done, that not only hurts us and hurts the American people, but it certainly hurts the model of democracy as a world system, as you're suggesting. So I think the first thing you have to do about China policy and world policy in general is fix our own mistakes, and that's going to take time, and I'm not overly optimistic, but if we can't get together and compromise is a dirty word, and we're divided, not to mention the appeal to various fears and hatreds, that's going to hurt our policy in general in terms of whether we have the infrastructure, the education, the science, and the resources to move ahead, whether we have a model of democracy and so on. So that's the first step we have to do in China policy, and I can't be too optimistic. On the Chinese side, it's a very fair point. I certainly have been too optimistic about political evolution in China. I was there, as Orville said, with my wife, and we had great interaction with Chinese reformers, and I met with Zhao Ziyang, who we now know was pushing for political reform. And so it was a much more hopeful time. And after Tiananmen, I thought it'd just be a few years before they would begin to loosen up. I was absolutely wrong, and that's why I said don't consider any of us China experts. We can't always predict. And so the biggest single question, I think, in terms of political science, really is China going to continue to defy history? Because there's no question almost every affluent society is built on the kind of institutions and freedoms that we're talking about. I certainly, reining in my optimism, I'm optimist in the sense I want what's best for the Chinese people, not to mention they'll be an easier partner to work with. But I don't think we should just assume that this system is going to survive forever, partly for the reasons I quickly touched on, partly if you want to get more concrete about it, a certain middle-class level when South Korea and Taiwan started moving toward freer systems and men and women do not live by bread alone and they want political freedoms. They haven't quite reached that level yet, partly because you have, I do think, the internet with all the censorship. Over time, I don't think defense can keep up with offense in terms of ideas seeping in, partly because I think the yearning for freedoms is universal and not just Western. So the jury is out on whether, in fact, they can continue to say, look at our system versus your system. But it really is up to us to fix our system in the meantime. And this is a big challenge.
Yes, and I just want to also add that I think that the internet has had a radically transformative impact on Chinese society. It just hasn't had the effect that I think some people here expected, which is that, oh, this is going to lead to some sort of revolution. But it has, I mean, it has transformed the way that China works, and it has led to a greater degree of openness, just not quite the level of openness that people had anticipated. And also, just quickly for your question about how China sees the U.S., I do think in other areas, though, certain features of the American brand remain incredibly strong in China, you know, for just things like U.S. education. I mean, look at how many Chinese people are coming here to learn. I mean, not only in universities, but at the secondary school level. Medicine, the U.S. healthcare system. Look how many Chinese people, obviously more wealthy Chinese people, are coming here and paying, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars out of pocket for U.S. specialists. You know, I think in the environmental area, I think U.S. expertise is regarded very highly. Fashion, you know, even tech companies. I mean, I think even companies like Twitter, which are blocked in China, still have a certain allure. So we do have some currency, and I think there are certain aspects of America that are still really strong, which, you know, we don't want to overlook.
And also, I mean, I would say one of the great sort of brands that we forget about, you alluded to it, Winston, is a freer life. I mean, we all have friends. How many people does each of you know who's coming to America from China, buying a house up here in, you know, Fifth Avenue, buying a business, got their kids in boarding school, aspiring to go to Harvard? I mean, the biggest brand of all is that immigrants want to come here, and the Chinese are leading the pack. It's not the Mexicans. Chinese number one, Indians number two. I don't know where the Mexicans are, but Donald Trump is way out of date on that one.
Well, And the biggest challenge to our system right now, particularly during this campaign, we won't get into political stuff, but I believe that what is unique about America is precisely this, that we can take people from all over the world and we move together, and through our diversity we gain strength, e pluribus unum, and that's what's threatened now. So until we fix that, we're going to have lots of problems, and not just with China.
So let's come back, since the title of this talk is about the 2016 vote. So let's talk a little bit about Trump and Clinton, not as candidates, but Trump and Clinton in terms of China policy. And so what would you imagine China policy would look like under Trump versus Clinton?
Okay,
what would the world look like?
Nobody knows what China policy would look like under Trump, above all, not Trump himself. I'm serious. This man is incoherent and has no idea what he's going to do.
I thought you were a Republican, Winston.
I've worked and voted equally for Republicans and Democrats. I'm a flaming centrist. I really am, and I'm about the last one left, I think. But so I say that in all seriousness, that Trump, we have no idea what he do. We don't know what his beliefs are. We don't know whether he'll change them. We have no idea who his advisors will be. It's entirely impossible to project. The only thing he's talked about is slapping on 40-50% tariffs and starting a trade war. And also, he's encouraged South Korea and Japan to get their own nuclear weapons and so on. But from the Chinese perspective, on the one hand, they're probably tempted to root for Trump. Number one, they don't particularly like Hillary Clinton, and they base it on a lot of things, but above all, a speech she gave, I won't go into details, but at ASEAN, which got the U.S. involved in the South China Sea maritime disputes. So they're not wild fans of Hillary Clinton. I'm generalizing for 1.3 billion people, but, in terms of the elites and so on. Secondly, they know that Trump, if he gets in, will wreck America's position in the world, so that must be somewhat attractive to them. That all our alliances will go down the tube, that will be disliked everywhere from Mexico to every Muslim country you can summon. And a democracy we're given a black eye. So all of that has to be tempting. But I think the more sober Chinese, probably including Xi and so on, recognize that he's too unpredictable, that we could stumble into a war with this guy. And I would say to the Chinese, first of all, I think Hillary Clinton will work for good relations, just like we will, despite what we're saying today. She may be a little firmer in certain areas, but it'll be mostly a continuity over 8 or 9 American presidents of both parties, a mixture of competition and cooperation, and, as I say, maybe a little firmer, but something the Chinese can predict and get along with. With Trump, they just don't know. And then on the specifics, do they really want a trade war when our market is so important to them? And do they really want their neighbors to have nuclear weapons beyond North Korea and so on? So I would hope that they would understand that their interests lie with the Clinton victory. But I'll turn it over to
I alternate sort of blowing hot and cold on saying, where is the China dialogue? How can these two candidates be in a campaign against each other and never mention the most important issues of the world? What are they talking about? Could anybody tell me? I can't. I don't know what they're talking. They're sure not talking about the things that matter to me, like, trade wars, climate change. I mean, Trump sort of talks about trade wars, and certainly not talking about the U.S. China relationship. Now, on the one hand,
I think you can blame the media partly for that.
Partially,
yeah.
But the media is a poor, weak creature at this point.
That's too kind.
Well, but I think, you have to also wonder, if they did talk about it, would that be a good thing? It probably wouldn't be. It would probably just be like kicking a hornet's nest, and you just get an awful lot of static on the line. So maybe it's just as well that they don't discuss anything serious.
I think they will in the debates. I think they're going to have to.
They probably will, but I'm sure, Winston, it will not be in a very coherent manner. It won't be, like where they have a
It'll be semi-coherent.
It won't be like we're doing it right now, is what I mean to say.
No, I think half of it will be coherent.
Okay, let's make that bet after this session is over.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you raise about the media. Just to kind of go on a side note for a second, because one of the complaints that you'll hear in China all the time is that the American media is anti-China, right? You'll hear that from all levels of Chinese society, and I've actually heard that argument made by rational, intelligent people, not just which is that how come we're not getting credit for all the good stuff we're doing? How come all the headlines are sensational? How come all the everything's about dissidents and everything's about human rights? So I asked this question because you sort of just alluded to how the media is being portrayed, and you look at how Trump portrays China, right? It's pretty black and white. China is not a good guy in Trump's world. It's like a very convenient enemy, and he's always talking about it. He has people cheering, and the Chinese are seeing this, right? So it's kind of it's just looking at both sides of the coin. We're looking at kind of an anti-Americanism in China. I mean, what must they think, right, when they see a major political candidate who's right now doing fairly well, who's using China as a punching bag and has so many people cheering for him, and a lot of the media is playing into it, and a lot of it, in terms of the trade wars, I think a lot of Americans really believe that, China's stealing jobs, China's to blame, and, whatever the case may be. I mean, there's a lot of misinformation also out there about how many jobs China is stealing and will steal in manufacturing. So I don't know, what do you think about that?
Well, somebody who's toiled in the vineyards of the media my whole life, I have to say that, I remember vividly being at a foreign correspondence club gathering in Beijing, and some member of the media, actually I think he was a Canadian, stood up and he just sort of blew a fuse, and he said, why is it that the longer you stay here as a member of the press, the more irritated you get at this place? And I think he hit something very sort of true, that actually the Chinese treat the media like dirt. And these people try very, very hard, in my experience, the good ones, to keep their balance. But it's pretty darn hard when the wind you're running against is, just basic things like, are you being followed? Can you get a visa? Can you speak with people? Are you worried that your sources are going to get locked up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And I think this poisons the well. And it makes it very difficult for people to sort of adopt a optimistic and more roseate kind of perspective.
I think that's true. I think it is true. The media does tend to focus on problems and frictions, not just with China, but just China, as opposed to good news, which you don't hear so much about. For example, at the Hangzhou summit recently, China-America, there was a long fact sheet about all the areas we're working together on. We haven't discussed some of the still remaining positive areas, which we should work on, but that'll never get any attention. It's only the frictions. That's why it's important to not only try to find areas of cooperation, but to try to give a more balanced perspective of our relationship, even though we're being bleak tonight. Not only are these ends in themselves, whether it's climate change, terrorism, Afghanistan, Iran, anti-piracy, pandemics, a host economics in some areas, all these positive things, we not only should do them, but try to find a way to get more attention. But the Chinese make it tough, just for the reasons you mentioned. They make it tough. I'll give you an example. Not only to harass our journalists, but they're now telling their journalists, and there's probably some in the audience who are good people, and I'm sure good journalists who are really frustrated, but they are now ordered to be organs of propaganda, not journalists. So I'll be very frank, and I want to stress this is not to make uncomfortable any of our friends from the press of China who are here. I have great sympathy for you. But I refuse to give some interviews this evening with the Chinese press because it's useless. And if I said two things tonight, I'd say, one, I want to work for good U.S. Chinese relations. And the second one is Mr. Xi is reckless. Which one would they report? They'd lose their job if they reported. What we are saying tonight, that's not going to get through to, they'll find out about it in other ways. But in terms of the Chinese coverage of this meeting, I can assure you it's not going to look anything like what we're talking about. So they make it very tough. And that's just one specific example that I can cite for tonight.
So I'm going to ask a couple more questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So if anyone has questions, you can start composing them in your head now. So the recent Obama trip, success, failure, somewhere in between? Well, how would you rate it overall? Do you think it was positive? There were definitely positive things that came out of it, but what would be your overall assessment?
First of all, there should be a process. Not only despite, but because of the bleakness that we're painting tonight, we've got to have constant dialogue, not only summits, but they meet a lot of international, Asian, and global meetings, whether it's UN or Asian meetings and so on. And that ought to be continued, even if it's tough uphill going now on reaching understandings. We ought to continue that, try to set strategic direction. So we ought to see this as part of a process, this one summit. We're beyond the case where you can have dramatic results from any one summit. You've got to keep working at this, and you've got to work at it with leaders talking without a lot of people in the room and so on for strategic direction. So in that context, it certainly was better than it looked. I mean, the whole stare episode, it's hard to believe the Chinese who were so good at hospitality would screw up like that, but I really do think it was not a deliberate snub. They're not that stupid to insult the President of the United States on purpose. There was harassment of some of the President's party and journalists and a lot of obnoxious things going on, but they didn't purposely make the President descend without a red carpet from the back of the plane. So that optic didn't get us off to a very good start. But they did announce a climate change. Not only have they been working together on this, it's very important, and this Asia Society and Orville have been at the forefront of this. But they now, in effect, said they ratify it, and there's a hope that this will come into effect by the end of this year. So that's a plus. And there are a lot of areas, I just ticked them off in the fact sheet, where we are working together and we've got to keep going at. So I think it went about as well as I would have expected at this point. But I want to get Orville's view on that.
Yeah, I mean, I basically agree. I think, you know, the thing that seemed to be missing, and actually it started to be missing when Obama made his first trip, I guess it was 2009, that I remember vividly being in China on many occasions and being on the Deng Xiaoping trip to Washington when Carter recognized, but going once with Clinton, with Jiang Zemin, 1997. This is right at, you know, still we were in the shadow of 1989. But you could see in the deportment of these two men a kind of an enjoyment in being together.
Well, which two men were
Jiang Zemin and Clinton. Were you on that trip?
No, but I was with them in the Seattle APEC Summit.
That's right. Well,
I have to contradict you.
Well,
I would find something to disagree on.
There was a little different.
That meeting was a disaster.
Yeah, well,
we, of course, played it up as one of the great diplomatic
triumphs. But you had demonstrators in the streets.
Well, what happened was, and I don't want to interrupt you, but unfortunately, it was partly Clinton's fault. He asked Jiang Zemin to talk about his domestic policies. We then had a 45-minute speech. And the chemistry was not good. It got better in subsequent years, but I have to tell you that first meeting.
What year was that?
That would have been 1993 in Seattle.
Well, then it did get better.
Yeah.
But I don't say that it was the halcyon period of, you know, paradise or anything. Only to say that compared to the body language between Obama and Xi, which is incredibly stiff.
Tell them what
proper.
Xi could have done on this stairgate.
Well, so we were just talking before we came out about after Stairgate. So there you have Obama coming out the back of a plane on a miserable little flop-down aluminum ladder. And then you have Susan Rice, the National Security Advisor, sort of manhandled by the security forces and kept from being with the president, et cetera, and the press was pushed around. But, you know, if she wanted to fix that, all he would have had to do is when they two got together at their press conferences, put his arm around Barack and say, buddy, you know, good to see you in China, despite the heavy weather at the airport. But end of story. Big smile, you know, glad you're here. But we didn't have any of that. It was very formal, very ritualistic, very standoffish, the kind of posture that leaders take when they're not getting along and there are big things dividing them, and they don't want to send messages out to their own people of being too accommodating.
Yeah, one thing that I thought was interesting about that trip is that there were some significant gains that came out of the trip, but all we were talking about were the stairs. And I thought it was actually quite symbolic, the fact that so many people here were so quick to assume that was a Chinese snub. Yeah. You know, like I think that actually
That's
says a lot.
That's a real symptom of the state of the relationship.
Yeah. So just one last question, because I want to make sure Orville's been working on this, and I'm sure Winston has great thoughts on this too, about the question of history. This is another way in which China is slightly an exceptional case, in that China has, how shall we say, edited its own history in many ways, and its own national narrative is very carefully edited. And I guess the question is, for you, Orville, and maybe you can explain a little bit your thoughts on this, have they gotten away with it? Does it matter? Because you have a young generation in China that, many of whom are just kind of, they're moving forward, they're looking to the future, they don't really want to talk about the past. Can China get away with their tailored version of history?
Wow. Okay. Listen, there's a whole other night's discussion here, but let me give you the short course of my views. That, I think, is the most crucial question of all. Can a human being, can a country sort of ignore their past? Could Germany have done it? And Germany didn't do it. Germany actually did in some very elemental ways.
Although the thing is, China doesn't actually ignore its past. There's certain aspects of China's past that they talk about constantly, right? Selective ignoring.
But I mean, ignoring the part you don't want to.
Right. But while emphasizing, as you've pointed out in your book, while emphasizing obsessively other parts of the past. So
I think this question of an edited narrative that's sponsored by the state and the prevention of other views from entering into that narrative as correctives is deeply toxic in the long run. I don't think that it's going to be very easy, but this is just my Western sort of post-Freudian, neo-Hegelian, I could go on view of history. That, a country cannot have committed such sort of massive abuses against its own people and not come to terms with them in some way and still be stable, healthy, comfortable in its skin, and comfortable in the world. Now, that's just my view.
A couple of comments on history and how it affects our relationship and complicates it. First of all, both our countries think we're exceptional in different ways. We think we're a city on a hill, and we have these values that ought to be universal, and sometimes we've had missionary instincts in promoting democracy and human rights. China, Middle Kingdom, they were number one for 4,000 years, and they had a bad 1.5 centuries. But essentially, they look at their culture, their history, most of which everyone else is either barbarians, tributaries, or irrelevant. And so they've got that sense, too. China has a mixed attitude. On the one hand, they have insecurity and humiliation from the West and this bad 150 years. On the other hand, they have this history of being number one Middle Kingdom. And so you have a mixture of arrogance and some insecurity and xenophobia and so on. So I think that makes it complicated. On the U.S. side, look how we keep changing our views of China. If you just take it from World War II, we always had either the evil Fu Manchu or the noble peasant of pro-buck. In the World War II, we were allies, and then we fought each other a few years later in Korea. And then you had the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward and all that, and so we saw them as blue ants, red guards and yellow hordes. But then we opened up with China. We got all romantic and in the 70s, and then we have Deng Xiaoping, and they're going to be new capitalists. Then we were building positive relations in the 80s. Then we got to Tiananmen Square, and then suddenly they were the butchers of Beijing. And then we started welcoming their rise, and we thought we could cooperate, and they'd be a responsible stakeholder. And now you got the Schell lured bleak prognosis tonight. So if you put these two historical attitudes and the vacillations in our relationship together, you can see why we have a complex situation.
Okay. Thank you so much. On that note, let's take some questions. We'll start with we have questions from that have come in via email and some questions from the audience. So, yes, sir.
Isn't China part of America?
Oh, sorry, hold on, I'm sorry. Actually, please wait for the microphone, and if you can identify yourself, that would be great.
Hi, my name is Ellery Gordon. Isn't China part of a mega trend that's happening right now, which is kind of an appeal to frustrated nationalism? I think it's happening here with Trump. I think it's happening in China. Isn't that really what's going on?
Yeah, I think it very much is. I mean, you see someone like Duterte in the Philippines. He's sort of the Philippines' Donald Trump. But you do see this happening all over Europe. You see in Hungary, you know, yeah, you see even in the Czech Republic, in Poland, and certainly in Russia, you do see this kind of new authoritarian sort of slash almost thugocracy in some places, which doesn't bespeak very well for the, you know, remember Fukuyama's the end of history and democracy had triumphed, end of the story. I mean, there are a few more chapters here.
Well, there's two trends. One, that's a very good observation. Democracy is at least, I hope, temporarily on the retreat, or given a bad name, and it's considered only elections, and then you get an election, and that doesn't mean necessarily democracy. And this nationalism, though, is not just with these bad guys. I mean, Japan, Abe, who I think is a good guy, but he's clearly very nationalistic too. And so one of the dangers in Asia is this tremendous nationalism around the region. I agree. This makes it tough because someone like Xi, if he's having trouble at home, he can invoke the foreign devil and blame everything on the outside and have a little dust up with Japan or over Taiwan or something to rally the troops at home. And also, whether it's Americans or Europeans or Asians, if you've got this nationalistic streak, it makes it much harder to compromise with other countries. And so I think that's a very fair point, that a lot of the tumult in the world today is this rise of nationalism, which in a way is ironic because you have the rise of non-state actors that are so important that have nothing to do with nations, whether they're terrorists or whether it's NGOs or business or whatever it is.
Yes, second row.
Hi, my name is Alan Harari. I'm so thrilled that you took a historical look at what's happened in China, because sometimes it appears, and I'm wondering if our foreign policy and our State Department is guided by the fact that there have been dynasties and empires and emperors and now chairmen, and isn't it just the same Chinese story, but now in a modern context? I mean, they were 4,000 years, as you said, the Middle Kingdom. They probably gained their wealth on the backs of the farmers, and now in an hour time, they've gained their wealth on the backs of cheap labor, and they're using that wealth to go and not take over, but certainly buy a lot of the rest of the world. So as we're viewing how they behave and how we interact with them as a society, isn't it a little bit of a replay, a historical replay of those dynasties and those emperors and so forth?
Well, Orville is much better on this than I am. Just a couple of quick comments, and I'll toss it to you. First of all, you got to give them credit, too. You can't just say it's on the back of, I mean, the Chinese entrepreneurial dynamism and spirit of the Chinese people. Look at it all over the world, wherever they are. Hong Kong, Southeast Asia, Taiwan, and so on. San Francisco. I mean, wherever the Chinese are. So I think the Chinese people, and that's been true throughout history, so I would give them a lot of credit. What is different, of course, is that the world is so much more interconnected now, and that we affect each other economically and in security and cultural ways, that it makes it much more difficult and important to deal with than in previous times of Chinese history where you didn't have to interact with them so much.
Yeah, I mean, one has to be incredibly impressed with what has been accomplished. And I do think much of that, well, you all know that, I won't get into it. It's unprecedented in world history. I do think there is a kind of a historical template, a yearning for greatness, as you alluded, Winston. They had 150 bad years, but they never sort of forgot that thing of China being the keystone of the arch. And I think now that they have come back to that, there is a tremendous sort of influence of these sort of historical impulses that are in their almost genetic makeup as recessive genes. Also, I should say, they're reinforced. We shouldn't forget they had a revolution, a Marxist-Leninist revolution, which had a whole other version of history, government, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that part, too, is being re-expressed in the authoritarianism, the one-party system. I mean, don't forget for one single minute that China's government and party structure, these parallel systems, was borrowed from Joseph Stalin in the 1950s, and it's still there. So they're both of these historical forces. Leninism, Marxism is gone. Leninism and sort of dynastic imperialism, that whole scholar gentry system of rule that I think are sort of irrigating Xi Jinping's drive for greatness again, and it does have an imperial aspect.
A little more sinister part of that, though, is some of the revival of Maoist themes. Some of these journalists and others who were abducted, by the way, and they're exporting their human rights abuses. That's what's new here. It's not just what they're doing to their own people, what they're doing abroad. So they abduct these journalists, and then they get them on TV, and they have confessions right out of the Mao era, which, by the way, invoke anti-Western influence.
Yeah, I would say that's also Lenin at work.
Yeah.
I mean, that's that. But it's also the traditional imperial system. There was no place for dissidents in the imperial system.
Sorry, is that, do you think, what's motivating the adventure in the South China Sea?
I wonder if we could get on to another question and this has become a dialogue between.
Well, let me quickly answer his question. The South China Sea is, of course, the key issue, the key irritant between us and China. And I do think that the South China Sea is an expression of this yearning that Xi has given expression to in his so-called China dream, of the greatness of China and it being sort of the key principle of Asia, having its way in Asia. And I think that's what we see written sort of very largely over the South China Sea, is that impulse being acted out of China's rightful and ascendant role in Asia.
Next question. Yes, over there, woman, right in the, yes.
Ellen Berenson, you alluded to the middle class group underneath the ruling elite that seems to be doing reasonably well on their own. Could you expand how you think that this middle class could make a difference in what goes on in China in the next, let's say, 10 years? I mean, will they have more influence, and how could they make a difference?
You know, one of the paradoxical facts of Jiang Zemin's rule was a thing called the Sangha Daibiao, the three represents. When that was uttered as a key theoretical contribution to Marxist, Leninist, Mao Zedong thought, people laughed. But you know what that did? It incorporated the bourgeoisie, the middle class, the entrepreneurs into the Communist Party. Now, go figure, but that's what happened. So these people in the middle class, who are the heart and soul of the modern private economy, which is about half of China's economy, are very dynamic, and they are also have status in the Communist Party system. And it is quite vibrant. And they are not, as we imagined them at different times, craving democracy and freedom. What they really want is to just sort of have a nice life, you know, good place to live, send their kids to school, do their business, and leave politics to people above them. But it's to not note its power and its transformative effect on Chinese life and its economy would be to miss something important.
Well, you raised a very good question again. We were talking about before about whether China is going to continue to defy history in terms of the impact of the middle class. The party has made a deal with the Chinese citizens. You know, you make money, but you don't make trouble. And so far, that's worked. So the big issue is at some point, like in other middle classes in other countries, whether that's going to change and they're going to want more than just making money. But so far, it's been working. There's no question about it.
And I think China wants to keep the middle class happy, too. So that's, you know, I mean, when the middle class tends to protest, it could be about something like, you know, we want our pets to be in this park, or, you know, it could be some very specific issue. They do have a lot of leverage, because just to look at one macroeconomic trend, which is really important, is that, you know, China has been, you know, a manufacturing export power, and it's moving towards a more consumption-based economy. And it's the middle class that's going to drive that consumption. So, you know, it's, or will be one of the drivers of that
But
consumption.
a couple of caveats for the Chinese, and I think the leaders recognize this. of tremendous income inequality, worse than the United States. So there's a lot of people out there who can't get into the middle class. Secondly, corruption everywhere, you know, and he's going after that now, partly because he feels he has to make the party look good and be legitimate, and it's a genuine effort, partly because he seems to find most people who are corrupt in other people's political factions. It's rather convenient, but it is a genuine effort to root out the biggest problem they have. But if you throw in quality of life, like the pollution and like shoddy construction or diseases that are covered up, there's a lot of angst out there. So even though the middle class has been bought off, they've got some huge social problems to confront.
Unsafe food is a big
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, unsafe food.
Environment, food
Right.
safety. I just want to take one of the questions that came in via email because it's interesting. This is from someone named Parth. The U.S. has been criticized for not having a real point person on China since Hank Paulson. Is that fair? And do you think that the Obama administration is not paying enough personal attention to the U.S. China relationship?
Well, Winston, you should start because this is right up your alley. I'm just a...
Well, first of all, it isn't fair to say Obama hasn't paid enough attention to China. Now, I think what he hasn't done, and I couldn't get Bill Clinton to do this either when I was working for him. By the way, I also worked for Reagan. I want to make it clear I'm bipartisan. Is to give a major speech on China and to give a strategic overview. I think that's been a real failing, both to put in perspective, as we said earlier, some of the positive things as well as the bad things. Right now, it had to be a little tougher speech, but still, there's been no strategic. It's such an important relationship that it's pretty hard for the president to fully delegate it. I think you can make a case for it, though, in the coming administration. And frankly, what I would do, no matter who's elected, obviously it's going to be easier if it's Hillary, is even in the transition period, I'd find someone very close and very prestigious, not just some middle-level bureaucrat, somebody of real stature who's close to the president-elect, and even in a transition period, start talking to the Chinese and try to begin to turn this relationship around. I'm not optimistic for the reasons I've said all night, but I think we should make that effort. Now, whether that person remains as the point person, it's a little tough for a Secretary of State or a National Security Advisor to sort of hand it off to somebody else. It really is going to have to come, frankly, on the whole, from the White House. Because you've got so many agencies with an interest, economic, obviously, as well as military and diplomatic, that it's hard to delegate it to one of those agencies. You need the honest broker and the representative of all the agencies, namely the White House. So national security advisors are pretty, because I'm a little biased, I worked with Henry Kissinger when he was, but I think that's probably, if you're going to have a point person, it probably should be the national security advisor.
No, I completely agree with you. I think that, we're at this sort of crossroads moment, and what we really need to understand, is it possible to continue down the engagement road? And I think the best way to do that, let's assume Hillary gets elected, because I don't know what to assume if Trump were to be elected, but let's assume she's elected. My own view is, first thing she should do is tell Bill to pack his bag and go to Beijing. And smoke this thing out for a couple of months and just go to Xi Jinping and say, listen, this is a critical tipping point moment. We either turn this thing around somehow, get some deeper and better and more trusting understanding about our intentions and our ability to collaborate, or we're going to both rue the day because we're going to fall into a more adversarial position. And there's no human being who has the status, which is immensely important to China, than a former president. Carter could do it, but he's quite old and he's had some health problems. But I have to say, I went to China with Carter a year and a half ago, and boy, they didn't treat him very well.
Well, he'd be the wrong envoy for a lot of reasons.
No, but I think Clinton could clarify the situation, Bill Clinton, and would be at a high enough level to get China's attention, give them face, and really express America's, and I believe that we have this sentiment, deep yearning and hope that we can somehow work together better.
Orville and I are both trying to make you less depressed after the last hour. So I will add to that effort. Despite what I've said about the Chinese leadership, I think they're realistic that they know the strengths of America and that they want to deal with us in a very self-interest, which most countries should do, obviously, and a very transactional basis. So it doesn't mean what the motive is. If we can cooperate in some of these areas, that's in our interest and the world's interest, given some of these global problems. And so with all our angst about what's happening in America today, I think he recognizes, as I do, and it's why I'm so frustrated about how we're squandering our assets, that in every way you look at it, I don't care what China's doing, and they to be admired for their rise, we've got incredible advantages. First of all, China's surrounded by more countries than any other country. There's about 14 of them. Many have nuclear weapons. Many had border disputes with China. Many have terrorists. They've got a real security problem. What does the United States have? We have 2 oceans, Canada, then of course we got this place where we need a wall, but still, Mexico. So we're in a lot better shape there. We have alliances all over the world. China has, or maybe Cambodia, maybe Laos, they're not really alliances, Pakistan, and I don't know what North Korea is, except they're enabling North Korea, and China's the problem on North Korea. We haven't got to it, not the solution. We have greater political system, I think, over the long run. We have better universities. We have energy self-sufficiency coming, or at least close to it. We have technology advantages. We have immigration, all the strength that brings us. There's no way we should screw this up in terms of good, peaceful competition with China, but we're doing our best right now to screw it up.
I think both sides are.
My only point is that Xi is realistic enough, despite his anti-Americanism and his fear of what we're up to realize they're going to have to wait another 20 or 30 years before they take us on head on. So they don't want a conflict. And in the meantime, they need us economically and other reasons. And I think he will be willing to work with us without any sentiment, but in pure Chinese self-interest.
Great. A question all the way in the back. Actually, behind first, because I think, and then we'll try to take 2. All right. Thanks. Sorry. We have. If you could just keep the question really short, so we can take a couple more.
Yeah. Want to gather the question.
Yeah.
Hi, my name's Joy, and I have a question. Before, Winston mentioned that nobody know who's Trump's China policy advisor. So my question is, if President Trump called you guys and said, will you be my advisor? Will you say yes? And if you got this chance to advise him on the China policy, what will be the priorities or the most important issues you want the president to know? And will you suggest him to continue the bilateral investment treaty negotiation?
Great, thank you. And actually, let's just take 1 or 2 more. Please, sir, the one who yes. Go ahead.
Yes. Hi. Winston and Orville, thank you very much, as usual, for a great presentation. Paul Speltz. The only thing I would like to add, Winston, on a comment you made, which is understandable, is that actually in China, and having come back there again from there recently, there is a lot of the Chinese at very high levels, in government in Shanghai and Beijing, etc., who are not looking at Trump being dumped as somebody who's dangerous, is going to blow apart the world. They actually, many of these people who I think are unrealistic, think that they can negotiate with him because he's a businessman. Mm-hmm. And that's what they say. By the way, several Japanese say the same thing. Right. So don't be surprised. They're not going to be surprised if something happens poorly in the debates, she doesn't win, he picks it up, they're going to be ready to negotiate. And one other thing, on AIB, it isn't fixed yet.
Okay, thank you. I think that's probably, we only have 5 minutes, so that's probably, unless you want to take one really quick question. Very quick, sir.
What are the respective positions of the major candidates with regard to China's role in North Korean nuclear development, and also China's territorial disputes with its neighbors?
Thank you.
I always forget all the questions.
Okay, I can tell you.
So let me start with this gentleman's question. I think it's a little bit unclear. First of all, I think it's not clear to anybody what we should do about North Korea. The only
It's clear to me.
well, okay. Well, we'll come to you then, Winston. I mean, I think we think we should tighten up the sanctions, but to do that, we need China, and China doesn't seem to be of a mind to fully play that role. Trump, and I believe that would be Hillary's policy. Trump wants to see South Korea become a nuclear, power, as far as we can tell. That's dangerous, although I think South Korea is a responsible government.
Well, first of all, in terms of advising Trump, Orville's much more apt to get the phone call than I am.
I don't think so, Winston.
Given the name calling I've done on Trump. It's a very good question, however. Seriously. This guy gets in, he's incoherent, he's totally uninformed, he doesn't want to learn anything, he doesn't read. But he's the President of the United States. And should you, despite your animus toward him and distrust and fear, go in and try to do damage limitation? And it's not, I would not call someone unpatriotic if they went in and worked for him. I just couldn't do it. This man is so repulsive, vulgar, cruel, uninformed, bigoted, that I couldn't associate with him, even at the cost of my great wisdom suddenly giving him great enlightenment. So I couldn't do it, but I would point out that most of the Republican Party experts and establishment over several administrations have said they won't do it. Now, it will be interesting to see whether they change their mind. But whatever candidate, in terms of advice, I would say read our forthcoming task force report, and that'll give you a blueprint for success.
Would I advise Trump? I mean, I share your sentiment, Winston, that I don't like to associate with such people because it just makes me feel poorly. On the other hand, I do have the virtue of being a writer. So perhaps my best function would be to write something and let him read it. And not have
he doesn't read.
Well, then his loss.
Okay, well, that's. I think we're pretty much at the end. But do either of you have anything you'd like to say that we just haven't got into, or just quick closing comment?
Well, yeah, very
wrap up?
quickly on advice, a little more specific besides the task force. First thing, as I've already said, get our own act together, both to get the resources we need and to show us as a model and strengthen our world credibility, not to mention it's so important for American people to get our act together. So that's number one, and invest in our future so we can be more competitive with China, whether it's education or science and technology or infrastructure and so on. Number two is the Asian rebalance that I think is a signature achievement, and I don't think it's all hollow or meaningless. And we've done a lot just showing up in meetings and joining institutions in addition to the military deployments. But the problem here is that the TPP trade pact, I don't think is going to get through our Congress. And because you have not only the lunatic left and the Democratic Party and the unions blocking it, but you have Hillary herself running away from it. And I think she would like to circle back, but I don't think she can get away with it politically. Maybe she can. And the Republicans under Trump, anti-trade in general as well as TPP, and that is crucial for our whole China policy as well as our Asian position. And then beyond that, we should do what we've been trying to do, namely search for whatever areas of cooperation. And as I said, there's still a practical, transactional, unsentimental areas where our interests overlap, and we at least have parallel policies, if not joint cooperation, and do that as much as possible. Meanwhile, avoid conflict. Our military-to-military dialogue is actually quite good in at least avoiding accidents in the South China Sea or anywhere else, but we've got to include the Coast Guard as well as the militaries and so on. So there's a degree of continuity there despite the changed circumstance. This would be, but I do think it starts with our domestic foundations and our Asian policy, and both of those are in bad repair right now.
Well, maybe just a very succinct final thought. I think if America is going to pretend to be a world leader, it ought to reflect a bit on how it might lead in this circumstance in some new and more sort of active ways. And I think what we really need to do, if you believe, as I think all three of us do, that we are at something of a crossroads, that then we are obliged to make as extreme an effort as we can. And many presidents have done this. Carter with the Arab-Israeli thing, Kissinger with China. We've seen this, George Mitchell with Ireland, to see if, in fact, we can breathe some more life into engagement. That's our only hope. It's a good hope. And if we can, great. And if we can't, then we really have to go up on our mountain and reflect on what's the alternative.
On that note, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you.